I think it's time to get started. Thanks everybody for coming. With Node 10 going into LTS at the end of October, I think it's a good time to tell you about some of the new features that are happening in Node 10. Before I start, just a little bit about myself. I'm a Node.js Core collaborator, and I'm also a member of the Technical Steering Committee, the TSC. We are 19 members. And whenever the collaborators cannot come to an agreement on a technical issue, we get to weigh in and have the ultimate say. I work at Google on the cloud platform. I'm responsible for Node.js. And before joining Cloud earlier this year, I was a member of the Chrome V8 team. And before I talk about the new features, just a little bit about the release schedule of Node.js. We have long-term support releases, LTS, so long-term support. They're supported for 3 years. Usually, our releases are only supported for 6 months, but the LTS releases have 3-year support. And you can tell that something is LTS if the number is even. So Node 6, 8, and 10 are LTS versions. 7, 9, and 11, they're regular releases and only have 6 months of support. If you're still running on Node 6, try to upgrade, because in April we won't support Node 6 anymore, so try to get on 8. If you have your stuff running on Node 8 at the moment, great. And then Node 10 is going into LTS at the end of October, so it's about time to upgrade whenever you can. And Node 9 is already out of end of life, but Node 11 will be released on October 23rd, and then you have 6 months of support for Node 11. So our release schedule is fairly complicated, lots of bars and overlapping. So what version should you be using at the moment? In production, you should use the current LTS version. So if you're on 6, upgrade to 8. 8 is good, soon you can use 10. And if you are working on a side project, if you're running some stuff just locally, if you're trying different things out, then it's perfectly fine to be on the current release that's not an LTS version. So at the end of October, whenever you run something locally, just work on a small side project, use Node 11. That's a lot of versions, and you probably need to switch between them because you work on more than one project in different environments, or because you want to try out what's happening in a future version, or if something's still supported in an older version. Use NVM for that, the Node Version Manager. I'm sure most of you do that. Don't go to the Node.js website and download Node. Use NVM and then download the different versions with that. There's a Windows version of NVM, so you can use it there too. And if you want all the nitty details of how Node.js does releases, there's a talk from my coworker, Miles Borens, that gives you lots of details. All right. So as I just mentioned, Node 10 goes LTS at the end of October. So this is what you can use in production very soon. And I want to show you a few of the highlights that went into Node 10. This is a good talk. You can zoom in and zoom out because the different topics are not very much related. So I hope that I show you something that you didn't know is in Node 10, or something that's interesting for you, something that you are like, oh, when I come back on Monday, I'm going to try out this new feature. It's actually solving a problem I'm having. So some of the highlights include HTTP2 went from experimental to stable in Node 10. An API also went to stable. V8, the JavaScript engine in Node.js, got upgraded to 6.8. And NPM with Node 10 also got upgraded to 6.4. And overall, security is a big topic for us. So we've been formalizing the security program more, and we have bug bounty programs. So hopefully, no major things happening in the future. No major security breaches happening with Node. All right, so HTTP2 is now stable in Node 10, so you can use it, and there shouldn't be any breaking changes happening. HTTP2 is a major revision of the old HTTP protocol with the goal of improving page load speed. It supports multiplexing, headers compression, And it has a more intelligent streaming management, so the result is reduced latency and therefore faster page load speed. The API is very similar to the HTTP1 API, so you just say require HTTP2 if you want to use the new one. And then it's just like the old one, well, almost just like the old one. It's HTTP2 create secure server. But if you're familiar with our old API, this should be fairly simple to make changes. And if you want lots of details about HTTP2, just stay in this room, not the next talk, but the talk after. And Irina is going to tell you a lot more about it. NAPI also went from experimental to stable. So what is NAPI? Lots of Node developers don't have a need for it. Or they do have a need, they just don't know about it. So NAPI helps you. It's used when you write native C++ add-ons. So I should start with that first. Not all your Node modules are JavaScript. There's actually Node modules that are written in C++ and compiled, and then you use bindings, and so when you interact with the modules, it feels like JavaScript, but the actual code is C++. So if you're using libraries like bcrypt or SQLite or gRPC, they do have a lot of C++ code in them. You just don't need to know about it as a user of the library. And an API is an API for native add-ons that will stay stable across versions of Node.js. So when you change the Node version, you don't have to recompile the add-on. So this is probably when you're not an author of native add-ons, but a user of those, this is probably something you've encountered. You do npm start or npm install, and you get this pesky error that's like, oh, build for a different version, you need to run npm rebuild, and then you do that, and it's still not working, and you delete your whole Node modules folder. So this is exactly what an API is addressing. It's an application binary, it's application binary interface stable, ABI stable across different versions. So if you're compiling, if the module was compiled and then you switch Node versions, you don't have to recompile. And again, if you just stay in this room right after this, there's a talk that goes into a lot more detail about an API. I briefly mentioned that V8, the JavaScript engine, got updated to 6.8. I believe Node 8 had 6.2, and now we went to 6.8. So as you know, JavaScript is constantly evolving. The EcmaScript standard is adding new features to it. That's why we sometimes transpile to ES 2.16, 2.17. So there's constantly features coming in. And as those features are specified in the specifications, the JavaScript engines implement them. And so there's a lot of features that get implemented in V8 over the last half year or year that are now coming to Node because V8 constantly gets updated in Node. Just picking a few here. So in Node 10, you can use async iterators and generators. You can use promise, prototype, finally. So all of this is in Node 10. Regex got a really neat feature, the named capture groups. So when you do a regex with capture groups, you used to address them by the index, and that could easily lead to bugs, and now you can name the capture groups. So say you have a regex for a date, then you could name the capture groups day, month, year, and then when you're referring to the results, there's never a question about is index 1 the day? No, you just refer to it by the name you gave it. WebAssembly is part of V8, and it's available in Node. WebAssembly got a bunch of improvements. One I'd like to mention here is the streaming compilation. So you can take advantage of that in Node 10. And big int support, big integers. I'll go into more details in the next slide. And just overall, there's been a lot of performance and memory improvements in V8, so Node 10 benefits from those as well. And a big thanks to Michael Zasso. He's doing a lot of the upgrades of V8 inside of Node. So every 6 weeks when V8 is released, he's doing a lot of work to make this run smoothly, and that allows everybody in Node to have a very recent V8 version. Okay. So BigInt is a new JavaScript feature. I believe it's in stage 3, so it hasn't reached stage 4 of the specification yet, but 2 major browsers have implemented it, and you can use it in Node 10. So the way numbers are specified in JavaScript, they have floating point precision. So depending on the calculations you do with floating points, you actually get wrong results. So if you look at this code here, you have a large variable a and b, and if you multiply them, you actually don't get the same result you would get if you do this by hand, or with a calculator, I guess. So that's just floating point precision. And that, of course, can lead to very weird, subtle bugs, especially if you have any financial application or something. So you can use BigInt instead. You just say BigInt of a times BigInt, like the BigInt constructor, and then the product of these 2 numbers is the mathematically correct product for no matter how big a and b are. You can use the constructor, or a little shorter to write is you just put a little n, like number, after the number, and then it's automatically a BigInt. NPM got updated to 6.4. If you're using a recent Node 8 version that also has NPM 6.4, so these features, you're probably already familiar with them. My personal favorite is npx, the Node package runner. It's such an improvement. For me, it basically gets rid of global installs. Like, I never, ever do npm-g install anymore. And that's really helpful because I never end up with the wrong version and a polluted global namespace. So npx is the Node package runner. And instead of doing npm install-g webpack, you just do npx webpack. And then it's running webpack if it's available in your Node modules. If not, it checks if you have a package JSON, downloads that webpack version and executes it. And if you're somewhere else where you don't have a package JSON, it just grabs the most recent version and then executes that. So it's a tiny little thing, 2 letters different from NP, 1 letter different from NPM, but I think it's really useful. And then also NPM audit for running security audits with NPM got added. Important, security is important. All right, so a few things went from experimental to stable. We benefited from the improvements that went into V8 and into NPM, but we also have some exciting things that are currently just experimental in Node 10. What does experimental mean? It means it's there, you can use it, but it might change. We might change it in a way that breaks your stuff. So we're happy if you try it out because we need the feedback. We can't, it's sometimes really hard to build something and go stable and never have any bugs that need breaking changes. But if you do use it, please, please, please don't be too upset if we end up breaking you because we have to make changes. So one feature that's experimental in Node 10 is worker threads. So you can run multi-threaded Node. A very cool thing is top level await and a REPL. REPL means read, evaluate, print loop. So that's when you just run Node in your terminal, and then you interactively do a command, enter, see the result, do a command. So the terminal is reading the command, evaluating it, printing the result, and that in a loop. So that's why it has this funny REPL name. The FS Promises API is experimental in Node 10. And not in default Node, but Node Chakra, that is a node that has Microsoft's Chakra engine instead of Google's V8 engine. They made an experimental release with time travel debugging. If you're using Microsoft Edge, they have a really cool debugging feature called time travel debugging. So that's a thing you can now use in this experimental Node Chakra release. Little more details on the promises, the FS Promises API. It's not super exciting flashy feature, but it's super useful. So it's for our file system module, the same API, but with promises instead of callbacks. So, and it is experimental, but this is available in Node 10 without a flag. And I'm pretty sure there's only going to be minor changes to it. Like you can use it without a flag. We're not totally going to change it and break everything that you used it for. So usually when you use the file system, in the old API, you always had to provide a callback, and then it was very hard to read, or you had to use functions for everything and like wrap it. You can use FS promises, the FS module with promises, and then you can, if you use 8 or 10, Node 8 or 10, you use async await, so it reads much, much easier. So very useful, not spectacular, but very useful. Then I like this one a lot. It's top-level await in the REPL. So a lot of times you're trying something out, and you're in the REPL, and you have a library that you have an API that gives you promises, and you want to use async await, and you're like, oh, I just need to read this file and then do something with the content. So you're like, okay, read the file. And it's like, no, you can do await here because you only can do await inside of a function. So you have to wrap all of this in a function. And at that point, you're like, oh, I give up on the REPL. I'm just opening a file and write it there. But we have this experimental feature where you do node -- experimental REPL await. And if you start Node with that flag, then you can use await top level in the REPL. So doing something like reading a file and then working with the content, you don't have to wrap it into something and have all this extra work around it. And if you combine that with the promises API for the file system, then it's just nice. It almost looks synchronous, even though it's asynchronous because of await. And I didn't mention this when I went over the summary, but EcmaScript modules are in experimental mode in Node 10. These, I would say, are very experimental. So the file system promises API, go ahead and use it. You don't need a flag. For the REPL, it doesn't matter if you use the flag and if it's experimental because it's the REPL. It's not production anyways. For modules, these are very experimental, and I'm sure we are going to break you if you use them. So there's still lots of stuff that we need to figure out, and I'm sure there will be breaking changes. So don't rely on this of being like this forever. Yeah, but it is supported in experimental mode. So you have to do -- experimental modules. And Node 10 supports dynamic and static import, but only for MJS files. So this is different from the browser. In the browser, the file ending doesn't matter. In Node.js, the file ending does matter. If you don't use MJS as a file ending and you're trying to use import, the compiler is just going to say, oh, an unknown symbol. It's not even very helpful telling you that you should rename the file. So the file ending is important in Node for EcmaScript modules. So if you do run Node with -- experimental modules, then you can use static and dynamic import. So here's a dynamic import, importing some variable, which of course could change dynamically. So the advantage is you don't load all the modules depending on a certain scenario. Whatever branch is taken, you can load those that you need. And then, as I said, it's important that this is an MJS file. Otherwise, it won't work. So lots of things that are stable now in Node 10, lots of improvements from new EcmaScript features from V8, NPX when you have NPM 6.4, and a bunch of things that are experimental. Some more, some less experimental. And if you want to shape any of those cool new features in the future, or if you want to help maintain and clean up any of the cool old features that are already in Node, Anybody can contribute. Node is an open source project. Your best starting point is probably to read contributing MD on GitHub. So on GitHub, we are Node.js/Node. There's the contributing MD file that links to a bunch of other resources. A good exercise is to clone the repo and to install Node.js from source just to see how long does this take, do I even get this far? Like that can sometimes be kind of tricky. And then just hang out on our issue tracker, like see what kind of issues are people opening, how are they being resolved, what do pull requests look like, what kind of reviews are people giving on pull requests. And maybe you have an issue that you want to raise, or maybe you see an issue where you're like, oh, I could actually fix this. Like, I can help with this. If you want more guidance, and since you're already here, on Friday morning, we have a Code and Learn event. You have to pre-register for it. But that's an event where we help you to get your very first pull request into Node Core. So you come, you show up, and we help you fix something in Node Core. And then the next time that you look at the release notes for Node.js, your name will be one of the contributors because you contributed. So I hope I showed you some features where you're like, oh, I didn't know that this is stable now or that I can use this. Hope I showed you something. Hope to see you on Friday morning so you help shape the future features as well. Thank you.